compilation of the best videos of 2025. Of the 2,200 passengers on the Titanic when it sank on April 15, 1912, only 700 survived. You might think that the vast majority of those survived were simply the rich in first class, but surprisingly, many of the richest passengers perished as well, including the richest person on board. Number 7. Charles Hayes. At just 17 years old, Charles began his decade-long career in railroads, first working for the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad Company. However, he eventually became president of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway Company, a company that was subsidized by the Canadian government to create a second transcontinental railroad in Canada. However, this project took some serious financial hits, and was about $100 million in debt. In 1912, Hayes went on a business trip to London, and while there, chairman of White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, invited Hayes to board the new RMS Titanic. So Hayes, his wife Clara, his daughter Orion, his son-in-law Thornton Davidson, his secretary Mr. Vivian Payne, and a maid, Miss Ariane, all boarded the fateful ship. Just moments before the ship hit an iceberg, Hayes reportedly made a prophetic remark. Hayes was smoking in the gentleman's lounge with Archibald Gracie and Edward Crosby when Hayes reportedly expressed concern that the trend to playing fast and loose with larger and larger ships will end in tragedy. The time will come when this trend will be checked by some appalling disaster. Unfortunately, he was correct. Just 20 minutes later, Titanic struck the iceberg, and like most of the first-class men, Hayes escorted the women in his party to the lifeboats while the men stayed to face death. Hayes, believing the ship would sink slowly, assured his wife that the ship would stay afloat for 10 more hours. However, the men in his party wouldn't see morning, as they would all perish. The 55-year-old Charles Hayes' body was surprisingly found, so he was buried at Mount Royal Cemetery in Montreal. His net worth was around $565,000, equivalent to around $15.8 million today. Number 6. George Dennick Wick. Born in 1854 to a prominent Ohio family, Wick launched various enterprises in iron and steel, serving as founding president of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, one of the largest regional steel manufacturing firms. Wick was also involved in banking, railroads, and many charitable causes. However, due to poor health, he had to step down, so he decided to take his family on a European vacation. Unfortunately for them, they decided to board the RMS Titanic. His party consisted of his wife Mary, his daughter Mary, a cousin Caroline Bonnell, and Caroline's aunt Elizabeth Bonnell. When the Titanic hit the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., Mr. and Mrs. Wick were in their cabin. His daughter Mary and Caroline Bonnell came to their cabin to tell them to put their life jackets on. However, George Wick reportedly stated, "Why, that's nonsense, girls. This boat is alright. She's going along fine. She's just got a glancing blow, I guess." Still, they all went up to the lifeboat deck, and George said his last words to the women as they descended in the lifeboat to the chilling waters. The 58-year-old George Wick was last seen waving at the railing, and his body was never recovered. His net worth was around $900,000, equivalent to around $30 million today. Number 5. John Thayer. Born in Philadelphia in 1862, Thayer began working at the Pennsylvania Railroad Company at just 19 years old, and for the next 30 years, he worked his way up to an executive position at the company, until he eventually became director and second vice president. In 1912, Thayer and his family were traveling in Berlin as guests of the American Consul General. Thayer, his wife Marion, and their 17-year-old son, John Thayer III, boarded the RMS Titanic in France. However, just a few days later, the Titanic collided with an iceberg. John Thayer Sr., who was preparing for bed, immediately went to investigate, and when he returned, he escorted his wife and her maid to a lifeboat. But, like the other men, Thayer and his son did not board one. Survivor Archibald Grace reportedly saw John Thayer looking pale and determined while talking with George Widener. Just a little while after, the 49-year-old John Thayer Sr. died, and his body was never recovered. But his son miraculously survived. He was just one of the very few people to survive the freezing water. Thayer Jr. was able to cling to an overturned lifeboat through the freezing night and eventually be rescued. John Thayer's net worth was around $1 million, equivalent to around $32 million today. Number 4. George Widener. George Widener was born to the extremely wealthy Widener family. His father, Peter Widener, co-founded the Philadelphia Traction Company and established electric trolley systems in several major cities in the United States. Additionally, Peter had various enterprises in tobacco, steel, and shipping. Subsequently, his son, George, followed in his father's footsteps by taking over the Philadelphia Traction Company and getting involved in various other businesses, including serving on the board of directors in the Land Title Bank and Trust Company, Electric Storage Battery Company, and Portland Cement Company. So not only was George wealthy himself, but he was also an heir to millions of dollars from his father. In 1912, Widener, his wife Eleanor, and his son Harry were traveling throughout France, looking for a chef for the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. As they were planning a return to the States, they decided to make the unfortunate decision of boarding the new RMS Titanic, a ship that was ironically owned by the bank his father was a board member of. After the iceberg collision, Widener placed Eleanor and her maid in lifeboat number 4, while he and his son talked to other first-class men. But just 30 minutes later, the ship had become fully submerged. The 27-year-old Harry Widener and the 50-year-old George Widener died. Neither body was recovered. George Widener's net worth was around $2.5 million, equivalent to around $81 million in today's money. But he was also an heir to his father's roughly $31 million, or $1 billion net worth. Number 3, Isidor Strauss. Strauss was born in the German kingdom of Bavaria, but due to anti-Semitism and better business opportunities, his father, Lazarus Strauss, moved the family to the United States. There, Isidor and his father, Lazarus, founded a glassware and tableware business, a business that sold expensive foreign porcelain, clocks, and vases in the basement of the Macy's department store, owned by Roland Macy. Eventually, in 1895, the Strauss family was able to buy Macy's entire company from his descendants, making millions of dollars by growing it into the largest department store in the country. Isidor had even served as New York representative in Congress. But in 1912, Isidor and his wife Ida were away on a European trip when they at the last minute decided to board the RMS Titanic. Like the others, during the night of the sinking, Isidor and Ida made their way to the boat deck, where both Ida and Isidor were offered seats on lifeboat number 8. However, Isidor refused to board, replying that he would not go before the other men. Still, he continued to urge his wife Ida to go on the boat without him. However, they had been married 41 years, so she refused to go on, stating, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so we will die together." With their minds set, Ida gave her maid her fur coat and insisted she go into the lifeboat. The couple was last seen on the deck, arm in arm, in a scene described by eyewitnesses as a most remarkable exhibition of love and devotion. The Strauss net worth was around $3.8 million, equivalent to around $110 million in today's money. Number 2. Benjamin Guggenheim. Like a lot of the richest people on board, Benjamin Guggenheim came from a wealthy family. His father, Meyer Guggenheim, was born into a poor Ashkenazi Jewish family. However, Meyer eventually struck it big in the mining and smelting industry, eventually acquiring one of the largest fortunes of the 19th century. So Benjamin, as one of his sons, led many of these mining and smelting operations, eventually earning himself a large fortune. When he boarded the RMS Titanic, he was accompanied by his mistress and staff. But during the sinking of the ship on April 15th, Benjamin went out on an act of sacrifice. After he helped get his mistress on a lifeboat, he reportedly went around the ship helping more women and children to safety. Titanic survivor Rose Ickard wrote in a letter, "The millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim, after having helped the rescue of women and children, got dressed and put a rose in his buttonhole to die." Guggenheim reportedly stated, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." One Titanic steward secretary, James Etches, survived the sinking and recorded Guggenheim's message to give to his wife. "If anything should happen to me, tell my wife in New York that I've done my best in doing my duty." Another steward, John Johnson, also received instructions from Guggenheim. "Tell her, Johnson, that I played the game straight to the end and that no woman was left on board this ship because Ben Guggenheim was a coward. Tell her that my last thoughts will be of her and our girls." The 46-year-old Benjamin Guggenheim was last seen with his valet, smoking and drinking on the deck, but his body was never recovered. Guggenheim's net worth was around $4 million, equivalent to around $115 million in today's money. Number 1. John Jacob Astor IV. Astor came from the deeply influential and wealthy Astor family, whose fortune really began when German immigrant John Jacob Astor I went to the US. He made millions in fur, opium, and real estate. In fact, John Jacob Astor I was the first millionaire in the US, and was the richest person in the country when he died, with an estimated net worth of $20 to $30 million, or around $1.2 billion in today's money. Consequently, his wealth and business expertise were passed down to his family, to John Jacob Astor IV, who was considered one of the wealthiest people in the world in 1912, and by far the richest person on board the Titanic. After months away on holiday, Astor and his 18-year-old second wife, Madeline, boarded the Titanic in France so they could be in the US for the birth of their child. However, just a few days into their voyage, the RMS Titanic hit an iceberg. Shortly after the collision, Astor reportedly spoke to Captain Edward Smith, saying, "Captain, my wife is not in good health. She has gone to bed, and I don't want her to get up unless it is absolutely necessary. What is the situation?" Smith replied with the grave news, "Colonel Astor, you had better get your wife up at once. I fear we may have to take the boats." So, with this information, Astor awakened his wife, dressed her warmly, adorned her with jewelry, and helped her to lifeboat number 7. However, just as they were about to board, Astor was called back. Survivor William Sloper recounted the incident, stating, "Colonel Astor was directly behind me with Mrs. Astor, and suddenly he drew back and pulled his wife back with him. Someone spoke to him, but I did not overhear what was said. At any rate, they did not follow us into the boat." Eventually, they found their way to lifeboat number 4, where Astor helped his wife, her maid, and her nurse into the boat. However, Second Officer Charles Lightroller was adamant that only women and children could board. Astor reportedly did not protest. He simply kissed his wife and told her that he would follow in another boat. But just 25 minutes later, at 2:20 a.m., the Titanic plunged beneath the waves, and the 47-year-old Astor was killed. However, that was not the end for Astor. His body was actually one of just 300 or so bodies recovered, so he is actually buried in Trinity Church Cemetery in New York City. Astor's net worth, roughly $80 to $100 million, or about $2.5 to $3 billion in today's money. Burn the boats. Conquer or die. This was the mindset of the Spanish conquistadors when advancing through uncharted territory to conquer the most powerful Native American empire. But how exactly did Hernán Cortés, with just a few hundred Spanish soldiers, orchestrate the downfall of the Aztec Empire? Was he truly a military genius, or did he just get lucky? Well, 3 years earlier, in 1519, Cuban governor Diego Velázquez chose Hernán Cortés to go on an expedition in the Gulf of America. Their mission? Explore and trade along the Yucatan Peninsula, but at the last second his charter was revoked, so Cortés went AWOL. He and his men had alternative plans. Cortés led his expedition further and further inland, not simply to trade and map, but to conquer. To make sure nobody would mutiny and abandon the campaign, Cortés famously ordered his ships to be sunk. There was no going back. He and his men now had one choice to make: conquer or die. God, glory, and most importantly, gold were now all of these conquistadors sought. Cortés pushed further and further inland, chasing rumors of gold and great cities that promised fortune. Fortunately, the expedition encountered two key players that would ultimately allow Cortés and his men to not only conquer Mesoamerica, but to even travel throughout it. Priest Jerónimo de Aguilar and a native woman known as La Malinche. Together, they would be crucial translators. With Aguilar speaking Spanish and Maya, and Malinche speaking Maya and Aztec language of Nahuatl, these interpreters allowed Cortés to achieve crucial alliances with numerous native peoples. Although the Spanish pillaged, raided, and massacred multiple tribes, they were ultimately looked upon as saviors, meant to bring an end to the Aztec Empire, which had brutally subjugated the surrounding tribes for over a century. Many of these tribes, tired of paying tribute with their resources and people, gladly joined Cortés and his expedition. By this time, Emperor of the Aztecs, Moctezuma II, had learned of these new travelers to his realm, so to try and appease the Spanish and actually prevent them from traveling to the capital city of Tenochtitlan, he sent them treasure. However, their lust for glory and treasures could not be satisfied. So even more encouraged to march on, Cortés and his native allies reached the city. What they saw made them think they were dreaming. Some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. It was all so wonderful that I do not know how to describe the first glimpse of things never heard of, seen, or dreamed of before. A complex, dynamic city built unlike Texcoco, with 300,000 inhabitants, more than nearly all European cities. Massive sculptures, impressive pyramids, intriguing architecture, and elaborate canals that flowed through the city. However, what interested the Spanish the most was, of course, the treasure: cotton, cacao beans, tobacco, and of course, gold. But they also learned it was built off of death. It's estimated the Aztecs sacrificed around 20,000 to 200,000 people a year to their heathen gods. Soon, tensions rose, as the Spanish learned that several Spaniards had been killed by the Aztecs while supporting a local tribe. Realizing he was severely outnumbered in the capital, Cortez, in response, decided to take Moctezuma hostage in his own palace, allowing the Spanish to indirectly rule Tenochtitlan through him. However, natives were not the only ones who threatened Cortez. His blatant disrespect of Spanish authority greatly angered Governor Diego Velázquez, so he actually sent men to arrest him. When Cortez learned of this new Spanish party led by Panfilo de Narvaez, Cortez left Pedro de Alvarado in charge of Tenochtitlan, while he personally led his best men to deal with this rival expedition. Although Cortez was able to defeat Narvaez, his absence from the capital led to disaster. Alvarado, known for his short temper, quickly exacerbated tensions between the two peoples, culminating in the slaughter of many Aztecs during a religious festival. Alvarado claimed he was simply trying to stop the human sacrifice, while the natives claimed he was after their riches. While the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, the consequences of this act were drastic. When Cortez returned, he found his men under siege, threatened by the revolting Aztecs. In a final, desperate attempt to calm his people, Moctezuma addressed the crowd, but it was no use. They were fed up with him and the Spanish. Sources vary on if he was killed by his own people or the Spanish, but one thing was certain: Moctezuma was dead. So Cortez, with no other options to hold off the rebellion, and low on gunpowder, food, and water, decided to order a full-on retreat. During the rainy night of June 30th, 1520, the Spanish attempted a desperate escape. However, things soon went south. The Spanish quickly discovered their only way out was destroyed. The Aztecs had destroyed many of the bridges out of the island, so the Spaniards had to rapidly build a portable bridge. And although some got across, soon they were surrounded by hundreds of Aztec warriors. Men on foot and war canoes from the water brutally attacked the conquistadors and their allies. And, weighed down by their supplies, weapons, and gold, the men found it near impossible to fight off the attackers and cross the narrow bridges. Eventually, the bridges collapsed, plunging over half of the Spanish into the water. An estimated 400 to 800 Spanish and thousands of their native allies had either been killed or captured, leading to their escape infamously being called La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. It was the worst defeat ever suffered by Cortez, but this setback would not determine his future. He wept for his fallen men, but the only thing he could do now is fight on. The Aztecs, now under the leadership of their new emperor, Cuitlahuac, wanted to finish the fight. So he sent bands of warriors after Cortez, who was retreating to Tlaxcala. Although the conquistadors were low on food, water, horses, and gunpowder, Cortez still devised a strategy to win. He would use his limited cavalry and ranged weapons in the wide open, flat ground near Otumba. So, as the Aztecs tried to overwhelm the Spanish with sheer numbers, Cortez organized his musketeers and crossbowmen into defensive formations, which cut down scores of warriors, while his small but effective cavalry force cut through even more. However, even with superior tactics and weaponry, there were still simply too many enemies. So Cortez personally led a bold cavalry charge straight through the enemy in order to strike down their commander. The sudden loss of their leader broke the Aztec formation and morale, leading them to retreat in chaos. The victorious Spanish were able to escape and regroup with more men, and more importantly, new supplies, such as cannons, horses, crossbows, and muskets. Soon, Cortez ordered a siege of Tenochtitlan, starving them of their crucial tribute. One by one, cities around the capital began to fall, but not simply by better tactics or technology. A far more deadly opponent had swept through the indigenous people: disease. The Spanish had brought with them smallpox, the virus began to spread, both among their indigenous allies and the Aztecs. With no prior contact, the natives had no immunity, leaving millions to die not in battle, but by disease they didn't understand. This was great news to the Spanish. Though they didn't fully understand the disease, it seemed luck was on their side. Still, the Aztecs fought viciously. So to overcome the defenders, Cortez ordered the completion of 13 specialty-built warships on Lake Texcoco. With these ships and his native allies' canoes, Cortez was able to battle the thousands of enemy canoes on Lake Texcoco. For 93 days, Cortez organized the persistent assault on the Aztec capital. Men, horses, and ships attacked and attacked. Hundreds of Spanish and hundreds of thousands of natives clashed and clashed. The siege began to tighten as men brutally fought in the streets. Finally, on the 13th of August, all resistance fell. However, that was just the beginning of the end. The vengeful Spanish and their allies slaughtered the inhabitants. Not just the men, but the women and children too. No one was safe. Men burned and destroyed many buildings while looting and pillaging the gold and treasures in the city. Several years after the incident, a Nahuatl poem was created. Misery is pouring, misery is felt. Tears are pouring, teardrops are raining there in Tlatelolco. The Mexican women have gone into their lagoon. The smoke is rising, the haze is spreading. Ultimately, many factors contributed to the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. Some factors were simply luck, like finding the translators Aguilar and La Malinche, and having their enemies suffer from disease. But if you want to win the lottery, you have to make the money to buy a ticket. Cortez took high risks and got high rewards. His charisma made men want to follow him, and he used what he had and made the best of his situation. Without allies or smallpox, he would have surely been destroyed, and he knew this, which is why he was able to exploit existing political rivalries in order to support his own ambitions. He commanded both the Spanish and natives in battle. He was able to gain allies and strategically and tactically combine their numbers and his technology to solidify his name in history. April 12th, 1861. It's 4:30 in the morning. A flash, a boom. Confederate cannons roar to life in Charleston Harbor, lighting up the sky above Fort Sumter. It's the first shot of the American Civil War. But why here? Why now? And why would Americans fire on their own flag? To answer that, we have to go back, way back, not just to the election of Lincoln, not just to John Brown's raid, but to the very foundation of the country itself. Because this wasn't just a fight over states' rights, it was about something far more explosive: slavery, economics, fear, and the future of an entire way of life. As you probably already know, during the 1850s and 1860s, the northern and southern economies were vastly different. While the Industrial Revolution had revolutionized the economy in the North, employing many workers in new factories, little had been changed in the South. Cash crops such as tobacco, sugarcane, and especially cotton made the South very rich. In the years leading up to the war, the South was producing around 75% of the world's cotton, making the South the fourth richest economy on the planet. Aristocratic landowning elite who controlled thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves became insanely rich. And although it is debated if slaves were actually more efficient or productive than paid workers, since the roughly 4 million slaves were literal property, they were one of the largest capital assets in the US at the time, with an estimated worth between $2.7 and $3.7 billion. This fundamental difference made their economy, politics, and entire culture different, leading to a massive divide in the country. Many founding fathers, including 4 of the first 5 presidents, owned slaves, but many were critical of the institution and believed that it would naturally be abolished in the following decades. George Washington stated, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for this abolition of slavery, but there is only one proper and effectual mode of which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority." However, concerned that the outright abolition of slavery would break the newly formed country, little was done to abolish it at the time. While the founding fathers weren't entirely wrong about slavery being abolished through peaceful legislation, as Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey would abolish slavery by 1804, southern states did not. The northern states simply did not rely on slave labor like the southern states did, which heavily relied on their slaves to grow their main economic export, their agriculture. So ultimately, the clash between these two ways of life and economics grew and grew. However, these differences would be greatly exacerbated by westward expansion. Every time a new territory was considered for statehood, the question arose, would it be a free state or a slave state? Slaveholding states had an immense amount of power for many decades, as each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person when states were given seats in Congress and electoral votes. However, as time went on, the North became more powerful. Millions of immigrants and the expansion of banks and factories led many in the South to begin to feel like vassals to the North. Southern states argued that they had the right to decide whether or not to allow slavery within their borders, based on the principle of popular sovereignty. Eventually, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed settlers in new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. However, neither the pro-abolitionists nor the anti-abolitionists wanted the other side to hold more seats or votes, leading to some minor but bloody skirmishes in newly admitted states such as Kansas, where both sides rushed to settle in order to vote on whether it would become pro-slave or anti-slave. Known as Bleeding Kansas, this influx of people fighting to determine the future of the territory often clashed in bloody encounters, foreshadowing the Civil War. John Brown, a radical abolitionist, tried to start a slave uprising, which only gave more cause for those in the South to be fearful of Northern abolitionists. But the South's ties to slavery ran much deeper than just the economy. Although Southerners deeply believed the economy would crumble without slavery, to many it was much more than a powerful economic force. To many in the South, it was a justified institution. Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens declared in 1861, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." While Confederate President Jefferson Davis stated, "The slave trade, however, so far as the African was concerned, was a blessing. It brought him from abject slavery and a barbarian master, and sold him into a Christian land. The slave trade has been the greatest source of permanent blessing to him." So yes, while tariffs, states' rights, territory expansion disputes, economic differences, failed compromises, and cultural differences all contributed to the South seceding, all of those reasons are intrinsically linked to the institution of slavery. If slavery had not existed, many, if not all of those reasons would not exist. Numerous factors contributed to the war's outbreak, but the central and undeniable cause was slavery. The South not only believed that their economy would be ruined if slavery was abolished, but they believed it to be a moral and right institution. So, if slavery was the overwhelming main cause of secession, why did they need to secede? And why didn't they secede earlier or later? Well, the election of Abraham Lincoln is the easy answer, but why was his election specifically the catalyst? Well, Abraham Lincoln was unlike other previous presidents. He was the first Republican president, but what exactly does that mean? Well, the Republican Party at the time was actually fairly radical. While parties such as the Democratic Republicans, Democrats, Federalists, and Whigs dominated early American politics, the emergence of the Republican Party was truly the first anti-slavery party, being formed from those who opposed the expansion of slavery into new states. Remember the terrifying uprising of John Brown? To the South, that is who Lincoln and the Republican Party represented. To them, this new radical president was keen on destroying slavery, and with it, their entire way of life. Rich Southerners feared losing billions of dollars. Poor Southerners feared becoming the lowest class in Southern society, and all feared a slave rebellion, corruption of their society, and the destruction of their entire economy. But outnumbered, the South could do little to stop Lincoln and the Republicans from being elected. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln became the first Republican president, leaving many in the South to question if they even belonged in the Union anymore. The Charleston Mercury newspaper urged Southerners to act, stating, "The issue before the country is the extinction of slavery. No man of common sense who has observed the progress of events and who is not prepared to surrender the institution, with the safety and independence of the South, can doubt that the time for action has come, now or never." The southern states are now in crisis of their fate. And if we read aright the signs of the times, nothing is needed for our deliverance but that the ball of revolution be set in motion. Lincoln tried to assure the South that he would not abolish slavery, stating in his inaugural address, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." But who would be the first to jump? Well, it would be South Carolina on December 20th, 1860. Stating, "But an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the laws of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution." Next was Mississippi on January 9th, 1861, stating, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Then Florida on January 10th, 1861, with their secession convention president stating, "At the South and with our people, of course, slavery is the element of all value, and the destruction of that destroys all that is property." Alabama on January 11th, 1861, stating, "Whereas the election of Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin to the offices of President and Vice President of the United States of America, avowedly hostile to the domestic institutions and to the peace and security of the people of the state of Alabama." Then Georgia on January 19th, stating, "The party of Lincoln, called the Republican Party, is admitted to be an anti-slavery party. Their avowed purpose is to subvert our society and subject us not only to the loss of our slave property, but the destruction of ourselves, our wives, and our children." Next, Louisiana seceded on January 26, 1861, and sent Secession Commissioner George Williamson to the people of Texas, stating, "Louisiana looks to the formation of a Southern Confederacy to preserve the blessings of African slavery, and of the free institutions of the founders of the Federal Union, bequeathed to their prosperity." And finally, the last one, before Fort Sumter, Texas, on February 1st, 1861, stating, "We hold as undeniable truths that the government of the various states and of the Confederate itself were established exclusively by the white race, for themselves and their prosperity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as inferior and dependent race." Although Lincoln was not even president yet, with 7 states now in the Confederate States of America, they began to assert their sovereignty by seizing federal forts, assets, supplies, and troops. However, it would be in South Carolina, the first state to secede, where the war would truly begin. You see, the entrance to Charleston Harbor had multiple forts, but since Fort Sumter was easier to defend, Major Robert Anderson moved his garrison there. This act angered South Carolinians, who saw it as a military escalation, a symbol of federal authority in a region now claiming independence. As one Charlestonian wrote, "It was like casting a spark into a magazine." South Carolina demanded U.S. troops evacuate the fort, but Anderson refused. He had received orders on December 11th from Major General Buell, stating, "You are to hold possession of the forts in this harbor, and, if attacked, you are to defend yourself to the last extremity. The smallness of your force will not permit you, perhaps, to occupy more than one of the 3 forts, but an attack on or attempt to take possession of any one of them will be regarded as an act of hostility, and you may then put your command into either of them, which you may deem most proper to increase its power of resistance. You are also authorized to take similar steps whenever you have tangible evidence of a design to proceed to a hostile act." Although James Buchanan did little to stop secession, he did try to resupply the fort on January 9th, 1861, with the unarmed merchant ship Star of the West. However, it went horribly, as Confederate troops fired the first shots of the war on it, preventing crucial supplies from reaching the fort. Finally, Lincoln became president in March 1861, but he had a major decision to make about Fort Sumter. He faced a no-win situation. If he abandoned the fort, it would look like he was recognizing the Confederacy. If he reinforced it with troops, it could provoke a war. He chose the middle ground, sending unarmed ships to give the troops humanitarian supplies, notifying Governor Pickens that an attempt will be made to supply Fort Sumter with provisions only, and that if such an attempt is not resisted, no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition will be made without further notice, except in the case of an attack on the fort. However, the Confederates declared that any attempt to resupply the fort would be seen as an act of aggression, with the Charleston Mercury stating, "Now the issue of battle is to be forced upon us. We will meet the invader, and the god of battles must decide the issue between the hostile hirelings of abolition hate and northern tyranny. So, with over 3,000 militia troops besieging the fort, the Confederates felt like their long-awaited sovereignty from the US would be achieved if they could just seize this last bastion of federal authority. So, with both sides ready for escalation, militia commander P.G.T. Beauregard gave Anderson a choice: surrender or be fired upon. Anderson refused to leave until his supplies would run out, so Confederates opened fire on the fort shortly after 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861. For about 34 hours, Beauregard's 19 coastal batteries unleashed around 3,000 shots at the citadel, though miraculously no one died. But with his ammunition depleted and supplies dwindled, Anderson and his Union forces had to surrender at 2:30 p.m. on April 13th. To the Confederates, they had just achieved independence from the US, but Lincoln disagreed, calling on 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, leading to the massive American Civil War. So slavery undeniably started the Civil War, but ultimately, the real reason people debate how influential slavery was is because of their heritage. Many in the South tried to justify the actions of their ancestors by claiming the war was much deeper than the abhorrent institution of chattel slavery, arguing that since the Constitution gave states rights on how to govern themselves, they were simply protecting their states' rights to choose. While this reasoning isn't even inherently wrong, the main right they were trying to protect was indeed slavery. However, that doesn't mean you cannot be proud of your heritage altogether. Many Confederate soldiers and generals did honorable things, while many Union soldiers and generals did awful things. You can be proud of the actions or traits of otherwise awful people. For example, the highest-ranking general to be killed during the Civil War, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston, was injured in his knee during the Battle of Shiloh. He might have survived, but during the battle, he had sent his personal surgeon to care for the wounded Confederate troops and U.S. prisoners earlier in the battle, leaving him to bleed out. General Ulysses S. Grant perfectly stated the Civil War in his quote, "I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. I do not question, however, the sincerity of the great mass of those who are opposed to us." July 4th, 1863. Many don't know yet, but today is the day the Union won the Civil War. But why this day? Well, in 1863, two major campaigns were happening at the exact same time. In the West, General Ulysses S. Grant was besieging the city of Vicksburg, and in the East, Confederate General Robert E. Lee was invading deep into Union territory. Both campaigns could change the course of the war, but why and how were these two places so pivotal? Let's start with Vicksburg. The city of Vicksburg was an extremely strategic city, as it was located on the most important river in the Confederacy, the Mississippi. This river was the life force of the Confederate cause, allowing the transportation of troops, weapons, food, cotton, and even information. Whoever controlled the river controlled the bridge between the west and east of the Confederate States. Additionally, the Mississippi was a major hub for world trade, a place that the South could gain and sell goods to other nations. The city itself was also a major communication and railroad center, ultimately earning it the nickname the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. For the Union, preventing the flow of civilian goods and military logistics across the Confederacy was a major goal. So in order to do this, they had to capture the cities and forts that controlled the Mississippi. President Abraham Lincoln even stated, "See what a lot of land these fellows hold, of which Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. We can take all the northern ports of the Confederacy, and they can defy us from Vicksburg." I'm acquainted with that region and know what I am talking about, and as valuable as New Orleans will be to us, Vicksburg will be more so. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had similar thoughts, describing Vicksburg as the nailhead that held the South's two halves together. Early in the war, Union General Winfield Scott devised the Anaconda Plan, which blockaded the Confederacy and called for a massive land and naval attack along the Mississippi River. Although it wasn't entirely implemented, the Navy did begin to rapidly build a fleet of ironclad warships. So when General Ulysses S. Grant became Union commander of the Western forces, he prioritized control of the Mississippi. In December 1862, after securing other forts along the Mississippi, Grant began his first attempt at capturing Vicksburg. But he had a major problem: how to actually get his forces to the city. You see, the thing about Vicksburg is that it is extremely well defended. The city itself sat on a 200-foot bluff on the east bank of the Mississippi, allowing artillery to rain down on any invaders. Thus, any assault from the river would be obliterated. West of the river was a landscape of swamps, bayous, thick forests, and muddy lowlands, making military movements basically impossible. The northeast was not much better, containing a jungle-like forest, which Grant quickly learned of during his first attempt, as his supply line was wrecked by Confederate cavalry operating out of the forest. But despite these setbacks, Grant persisted in his attempts. Finally, he concocted his brilliant, albeit highly risky plan. Since the only place to position troops around Vicksburg was the southeast, he needed to get his troops there. To do this, he ordered Admiral Porter's ironclad ships to cut down past Vicksburg so that his ships could transport Grant's army across the Mississippi, enabling his army to be positioned southeast of Vicksburg. This plan was, of course, extremely risky. First off, he led his army through the thick swamps southwest of Vicksburg. Then he waited for Admiral David Porter, a man whose successes determined the outcome of this campaign. Fortunately, on April 16th, Porter rapidly made his daring descent down the Mississippi. Confederate bonfires lit up all around him as their artillery edged closer and closer to his fleet. Nevertheless, he doesn't falter and successfully makes it down the Mississippi. With his transport ship set, Grant needed his army to cross the Mississippi. So, to stretch the Confederate forces, he instructed Sherman to distract the Confederates in the north, while General Grierson distracted them in the east. The distractions allowed Grant to successfully land, stunning Confederate General John C. Pemberton, who was in charge of the defense of the city. Even though Grant's large 40,000 Union force was near Vicksburg, he still had extreme difficulties. The entire plan relied on him having to operate deep in enemy territory, subsequently cutting off his critical supply lines as his men tried to live off the land. To protect his rear, Grant turned to the Mississippi capital of Jackson. There, General Joseph E. Johnston was assembling a relief force for Pemberton. On May 1st, Grant severed his supply lines to rush deeper into enemy territory, but Johnston actually retreated, allowing Grant to occupy Jackson. This victory not only deprived Pemberton of reinforcements, but it also cut off Vicksburg from their critical supplies they got from Jackson. So, with vulnerability in Vicksburg, Grant marched towards the city. Although Vicksburg was surrounded, the city was still heavily fortified. However, with the blazing summer fast approaching, Grant decided to act, ordering multiple assaults on May 19th and 22nd. Unfortunately for him, these attacks proved costly, with the Confederate network of trenches and artillery preventing any substantial holdings. With little choice, Grant reluctantly settled in for a siege, ordering his roughly 70,000 troops to construct over 15 miles of zigzagging trenches that steadily brought them closer to the Confederate positions. While Grant settled in for a siege in May, let's look at what was happening in the Eastern Theater at the same time. In early May, General Robert E. Lee decisively defeated General Hooker at the Battle of Chancellorsville, but he had a very difficult choice to make, one that could win the South the war or make them lose it. Head west to reinforce Pemberton at Vicksburg to stop the city from falling to the Union, or charge north to the capital of Washington, D.C. to try and pressure a peace deal. With Lee roughly 900 miles away, it was highly unlikely he or any forces he sent west would arrive in time to affect the outcome. And with an invasion, some believed the Union would send troops west, relieving more pressure off of Vicksburg. Additionally, with the Confederate army in the north, the southern farmers would be able to replenish their crops easier, while the invaders lived off the northern soil. Lee also incorrectly read the political situation. He assumed many in the north were on the verge of peace, and that their war effort was failing. Ultimately, all these factors persuaded Lee to invade the north once again, this time much deeper and much more ambitious. Lee began the campaign on June 3rd, first moving his 75,000-strong army away from Fredericksburg and into the Shenandoah Valley. From there, his march would be much more concealed. Then, as they arrived in Northern Territory, they would disperse into multiple smaller forces, where they would gather supplies. Various skirmishes had occurred in the countryside, but Lee just learned of some terrifying information. The newly appointed general, George Meade, and his 90,000-man army was rapidly approaching. Lee immediately ordered all his scattered forces to Cashtown, 8 miles northwest of Gettysburg. General Henry Heath was the first to arrive, in search of supplies, specifically shoes. But at the same time, Meade had sent some of his force to Gettysburg. The ensuing clash just so happened to start the bloodiest battle of the war. In the early morning of July 1st, General Heath engaged General John Buford. The Confederates launched an attack that pushed Buford back, though fortunately for him, he was reinforced by General Reynolds. Though just as quickly as he came, Reynolds was lost, as he was shot in the head. This disaster prevented the Union from adequately holding the line. The battle began to exacerbate as A.P. Hill's corps backed up Heath. With more and more troops arriving, the Confederates were able to continuously push back the Union to Cemetery Hill. By the afternoon, the Union's position began to solidify, looking like a giant fishhook. The Union position is already strong, but the interior lines easily allowed reinforcements to any sector. In the afternoon, General Ewell considered the hill too fortified to assault. So thus ends the first day of the battle, which would determine the fate of the country. In the west, the Confederate situation looked way more bleak. Grant's artillery had been pummeling the city day and night for 6 weeks. Pemberton reported that roughly a third of his force was no longer able to fight. Grant's lines were closing in, tightening the noose around the city, and he was even preparing another assault. Civilians and soldiers inside starved, and many became very ill. The civilians could only bear the carnage by hiding in caves and eating anything they could find. One soldier reportedly stated, "If you can't feed us, you had better surrender us," horrible as the idea is. With few supplies left, General Pemberton saw 2 outcomes, either to evacuate the city and cut my way out, or to capitulate upon the best attainable terms. So on July 1st, he asked his commanders about the condition of the men and if they could possibly fight their way out. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 2nd. The Union has heavily fortified their hills, causing General Longstreet to suggest a retreat toward Washington, D.C., to make the Union fight them on more favorable ground. However, the rest of the generals heavily disagreed, so Lee ordered a reluctant Longstreet to assault the Union left, while General Ewell would attack the right. However, the Union actually struck first. General Sickles defied Meade's defensive plan and instead went on the offensive, moving his troops to the higher ground near the peach orchard. Longstreet's men assaulted the Union positions, engaging in brutal fighting. Many targets, such as the wheat field, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top, changed hands multiple times. Due to miscommunication, which happened often with the Confederates, Ewell didn't begin his right flank assault until evening, so even though he gained some ground, darkness ultimately halted any more advancement. July 2nd, Vicksburg. Pemberton's officers were unanimous in their response to him. Grant's siege had broken them. Any attempt to cut through the Union line and escape would end in catastrophe, and since there was no prospect of being relieved, their situation was truly futile. Pemberton had only one choice: surrender. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 3rd. Despite harsh casualties from the previous day, General Lee believed Union resistance was slowly crumbling. He saw that Meade had to reinforce his flanks, thus weakening his center. This was something Lee planned on exploiting. Even better, Lee had been reinforced by General Jeb Stuart's cavalry and General Pickett's infantry. With these men, Lee ordered a massive spearhead assault into Meade's center. After a massive cannon bombardment that ultimately did nothing, Pickett's charge began at 3 p.m. In the sweltering heat, the Confederates crossed almost a mile of open fields just to get to the Union lines. Thousands of rifles and massive barrages of artillery rained down upon them. About half of the 12,000 men involved in the charge were killed, captured, or wounded, shattering any hopes of a favorable outcome for the South. Lee was devastated, stating, "It's all my fault. It is I who have lost this fight." July 3rd, Vicksburg. At almost the exact same time that Pickett's bloody charge took place, General Grant and General Pemberton met to discuss surrender. Unconditional surrender Grant, as you might have guessed, demanded unconditional surrender, but ultimately Grant allowed the roughly 30,000 Confederates in Vicksburg to be paroled rather than imprisoned. Independence Day, July 4th, 1863. Jubilation for the Union, utter despair for the Confederates. In the early rainy morning of the 4th, Lee withdrew from Gettysburg. In the west, Pemberton, at 10 a.m., officially surrendered his men in the city to General Grant. The men who bravely defended the city for 47 days began to march out, stack their rifles, and fold their flags. The entire campaign since March 29th claimed 10,000 Union casualties, to the Confederates 9,000, plus the 29,000 that surrendered. The consequences. For Gettysburg, the Union had just beaten the Confederates in the most northern battle, the third largest and the bloodiest. Lee's 75,000-man force suffered 28,000 casualties, almost 40%. The Confederacy, unlike the Union, simply could not replenish men as fast or as easily. Their manpower had been severely weakened. Second, the Union got a massive morale boost, decisively defeating Lee after a series of defeats. Never again would the South be able to mount an invasion into the North. For the rest of the war, the South would be on the defensive. The consequences of Vicksburg. Of course, the biggest consequence was that the Mississippi, the lifeblood river of the Confederacy, was now in Union hands. Their country was split between the East and the West. In the words of Abraham Lincoln, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." With the loss of Vicksburg, the Confederate states west of the Mississippi, including Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, were cut off from the rest of the Confederacy, disrupting military communication, troop movements, and the flow of vital supplies. Again, the Union had just deprived the Confederacy of manpower, and it heavily boosted Union morale. Another massive consequence of the Vicksburg victory is that it put the Union's best general in command of the war. Grant's brilliant campaign at Vicksburg convinced President Lincoln to give him command. July 4th, 1863 will forever be the second most influential July 4th in American history. The date of dual victories, one in the West and one in the East, that took almost 60,000 Southern troops out of the war. It will forever be seen as the point in the war where the Confederacy had no prospects of victory, the Independence Day that won the Civil War. Thomas Stonewall Jackson. His nickname of Stonewall is so famous that you literally cannot mention him without his iconic nickname. But did you know he has 3 other lesser-known nicknames, one of which was even more popular during his life? One of his earliest nicknames is actually Tom Fool, a nickname that actually doesn't sound that great. So how did this legendary general get it? Well, it was actually before the Civil War, and while he was teaching at the Virginia Military Institute. You see, Jackson was seen as an incredibly boring, rigid, and strict teacher by a lot of his students. He reportedly would memorize his lectures and simply repeat them in a monotone voice, and when students would ask questions, he was known to simply repeat his lectures over again. One of his former cadets, Major Rumbaugh, is quoted as, "silent, strict, precise." His very attitude in the classroom was a lesson and a curb to the cadet student. Whether in the classroom or during the drill and battery, frivolity was never a countenance or for a moment tolerated. Standing upon the elevated platform of his classroom, firmly erect and in the exact position of a soldier, his voice was firm, quick in questioning or demonstration. He was quick to detect ignorance of the subject in question, and equally quick to recognize and reward a thorough demonstration. But another reason for this nickname was his odd habits. Jackson apparently believed that one side of his body was heavier than the other, so he would raise his heavier arm up to improve his circulation. Jackson also was a fan of lemons, and was often seen sucking on them. Ultimately, his teaching style and habits led to some students calling him Tom Fool. However, some doubt if students ever actually did call him that. Another nickname of his was Old Jack, a nickname that was actually more popular among his soldiers than even Stonewall. The nickname seems to originate when he was enrolled at West Point as a cadet. Since he was a little bit older than the average age of most of his peers, he was sometimes called Old Jack. During the American Civil War, his soldiers, oftentimes younger than him, used the affectionate nickname Old Jack, a name that balanced authority and endearment. His final major nickname was Old Blue Light. This nickname is pretty self-explanatory. Jackson was known for his piercing pale blue eyes. Some say his eyes blazed when he was excited or angry, so his eyes were said to be glowing like blue fire, especially during battle. However, there's also another meaning to this nickname, his Christian faith. Jackson had immense religious zeal, often praying before battles and attributing military successes to divine guidance. So according to some accounts, just like during battle, Jackson's blue eyes were said to blaze or gleam during his passionate spiritual speeches. So there's actually a Christian twist to his name, with the alternative nickname Blue Light Presbyterian. In fact, there is even a poem written about him that mentions his nickname in the verses. The shrewd, dry smile, the speech so pat, so calm, so blunt, so true. The blue light elder his foe knows well. Says he, that's Banks, he don't like shell. Lord save his soul, we'll give him hell. In Stonewall Jackson's way. Silence, ground arms, kneel off, caps off. Old Blue Light's going to pray. I fear that the Jews will believe Napoleon to be their promised Messiah, Austrian Chancellor Clemens von Metternich. Although the accuracy of this quote is debated, it does prompt a massive question. Why did some think Napoleon was the Jewish Messiah? Well, for over 1,000 years, the vast majority of European leaders treated Jews horribly, relegated them to ghettos, barring them from jobs, and straight up massacring them. And although there were some European leaders that lifted some restrictions and were less harsh than others, none compared to a man born in Corsica, August 15th, 1769. Even before Napoleon Bonaparte even became emperor, he was more favorable to the Jews than most. One of the earliest instances of this was during his Italian campaign. While there, Napoleon sought to spread the French revolutionary ideals. one of which was the abolishment of discrimination based on religion or origin. He led his army down into Italy, defeating the Austrians and subsequently liberating the Jews, tearing down their ghettos. But his Jewish liberation took on a whole different level while he was on his Egyptian campaign. While besieging the city of Acre, he actually wrote an incredibly rare and interesting proclamation. This proclamation basically calls on the Jews to reclaim their homeland. But, unfortunately for Napoleon and the Jews, his campaign was unsuccessful. So the proclamation was never officially sent out, causing many to question its authenticity. It isn't entirely clear how accurate the proclamation is, or what Napoleon's true intentions were, if it even is true. Some believe the proclamation was purely for propaganda purposes, not real and not intended to be taken literally, while others argue it is true given the context, since he did liberate the Jewish ghettos in Italy. And on top of everything, Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, reportedly stated in a letter, "What couldn't be fulfilled under the rule of Napoleon I can be fulfilled by Wilhelm II. But this is some shaky evidence, so let's look at some more solid evidence on how he treated them during his reign as emperor. When Napoleon became emperor, he saw the Jews as a people who could benefit his new empire. In lands he conquered, he abolished their ghettos, allowed them to serve in the military, and even recognized Judaism as one of the religions of France. However, he did see major problems with them. Napoleon especially despised their role as moneylenders, like most people did, stating, "It is necessary to reduce, if not destroy, the tendency of Jewish people to practice a very great number of activities that are harmful to civilization and to public order in society in all the countries of the world. It is necessary to stop the harm by preventing it. To prevent it, it is necessary to change the Jews. Once part of their youth will take its place in our armies, they will cease to have Jewish interests and sentiments. Their interests and sentiments will be French." So it is clear that instead of straight up killing them, Napoleon simply wanted to integrate them into French society, making them nationalists for his French Empire. We can see this thinking in another quote. During his time in exile, Napoleon's physician asked Napoleon why he treated the Jews so well. He is quoted as saying, "My primary desire was to liberate the Jews and make them full citizens. I wanted to confer upon them all the legal rights of equality, liberty, and fraternity as was enjoyed by the Catholics and Protestants. It is my wish that the Jews be treated like brothers, as if we were all part of Judaism. As an added benefit, I thought that this would bring to France many riches because the Jews were numerous and they would come in large numbers to our country where they would enjoy more privileges than any other nation. Without the events of 1814, most of the Jews of Europe would have come to France where equality, fraternity, and liberty awaited them, and where they could serve the country like everyone else." Although he wanted to assimilate Jews into France, he questioned if they could or even would. So he decided to get some answers. He assembled 112 Jewish leaders from across his empire, convening them in the Council of Notables. There, they would have 12 questions to answer for Napoleon. But many of these questions didn't have concrete answers. Still, the leaders needed to answer carefully. The fate of Jews everywhere could depend on it. Ultimately, they decided to give Napoleon the answers he wanted, basically stating that the Jews would respect Napoleon's laws. It is clear Napoleon got what he wanted, stating, "This is not the way to solve the Jewish question. I will never accept any proposals that will obligate the Jewish people to leave France, because to me the Jews are the same as any other citizen in our country. It takes weakness to chase them out of the country, but it takes strength to assimilate them." When confronted with pushback, Napoleon stated, "We must prevail in encouraging the Jews, who are only a very small minority amongst us. In the East Department, we find a great number of Jews that are very honest and industrious." However, many were very upset with Napoleon's new rules, specifically the Russians and Tsar Alexander I. Ultimately, pressure against his Jewish rules was simply too much, so he eventually caved under pressure to launch the infamous decree in 1808. This decree, in short, severely restricted the Jews' ability to lend money by clearing any debts to them. However, it is clear that his plan was simply to reduce criticism. Many of his laws weren't enforced, or simply did not apply to some of the Jews in his realm, and after about 4 years, most rules ceased to exist. Ultimately, many Jews looked to Napoleon as a liberator, and a few even saw him as a messianic figure. The majority of Jews in Italy specifically called him Helek Tov, the good part. Even though Napoleon destroyed some of the harsh restrictions on Jews, some actually preferred it to assimilation, believing that keeping their culture in persecution was better than losing some of it in assimilation. In fact, some argue he was just as bad, saying that instead of destroying Judaism by force, he chose to destroy it through assimilation. Still, it is clear Napoleon left a major mark in European Jewish history. Myth number 1. Napoleon was short. Being short is subjective. If you just want to classify anyone below the average male height as short, then Napoleon fits that criteria by today's standards, as the average male height today globally is around 5'7.5" or 170 centimeters. According to the French measurement system, Napoleon was 5'2", but the French inch, pouce at the time, was 2.7 centimeters, while the imperial inch was shorter at 2.54 centimeters. His height was measured and verified as just over 2 peds 2 pouces. That equals about 1.67 meters, or slightly under 5'6". So if you take into account the average height of the Frenchman at the time, which was around 5'4" or 163 centimeters, Napoleon might have even been slightly taller than the average man. This myth was spread by his enemies, mostly the British, and specifically cartoonist James Gillray, whose caricature depictions of Napoleon were so popular that Napoleon stated that Gillray did more than all the armies of Europe to bring me down. Myth number 2. Napoleon was Italian. This is a myth inside of a myth. You see, Napoleon wasn't born in France, but actually on the island of Corsica. Since Corsica was owned by the Italian city-state of Genoa for centuries, many Italians, like Napoleon's family, immigrated to the island. However, like many Corsicans, his parents, Carlo Maria di Bonaparte and Letizia Romanino, saw Corsica as its own entity, not Italian or French. In fact, France had purchased the island just 15 months before Napoleon was born, making him French, though his ancestors came from Italy. In fact, he was born as Napoleone di Bonaparte, but when he married Josephine, he made himself sound more French by dropping the second E in his first name and U in his last name. So this myth isn't entirely wrong, but it's not entirely correct. Myth number 3. Napoleon was defeated solely by the Russian winter. The Russian winter is infamous for defeating any invading army, but it is given more credit for defeating Napoleon than it should have. You see, Napoleon invaded in June, the summer, and what's not well known about Russia is that the summer is also very brutal. The summer heat decimated many of his troops before Napoleon really even got started in his invasion. Another factor for his defeat was the sheer size of Russia. Napoleon had to march his army of about 650,000 about 15 to 20 miles, or about 24 to 32 kilometers a day, with a total march of around 2,000 miles or 3,200 kilometers. And since the Russians burned everything behind them as they retreated, Napoleon had to rely on his supply train to supply his troops. Obviously, his supply train being so long prevented quick movement, but more importantly, it was left very vulnerable to attack. And obviously without supplies, you can't properly invade a country. So there were actually many factors that contributed to Napoleon's defeat in Russia, not just the winter. Myth number 4. Napoleon continued/ended the ideals of the French Revolution. Many people believe that when Napoleon came to power, he destroyed the ideals of the French Revolution, while others believe he continued them. Like basically everything in history, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. You see, Napoleon would not have had any power if the French Revolution didn't happen, so he made sure one of the ideals he continued was the expansion of a merit-based system. His Napoleonic Code also expanded on other revolutionary principles. In fact, the very fact that all citizens across the country, regardless of class, would adhere to these laws expanded on the revolutionary ideals. The code increased property rights, freedom of religion, and general education. It also reformed the banks and currency and improved infrastructure. By and large, his code gave many more opportunities to those who were in lower classes, allowing them to advance in France, unlike many other European countries which were much more elitist, caring much more about who you were born to. Like I said, Napoleon, who came from a relatively humble background, did much to expand equality of opportunity. This was the biggest expansion of the ideals of the French Revolution. However, Napoleon also ended many other ideals. His very rulership got rid of the Republic in exchange for a centralized autocratic government. Many journalists and newspapers were shut down as political freedoms were heavily censored to promote order and stability. His extensive police state monitored political opposition and often imprisoned them, while men were given much more control over their wives, and equality for women was scaled back. Myth number 5. Napoleon came from a powerful family. While Napoleon's family were nobles from Corsica, they were relatively poor and not very respected by the native French nobles. In fact, this led to Napoleon often suffering from discrimination from his fellow students, as he was the only Corsican, had poor French, and spoke with an accent. Myth number 6. Napoleon wanted to conquer the world. While Napoleon did have expansive ambitions, his main objective was simply to secure a European empire. He wanted to expand French influence over territories that had historically threatened or aligned with France. And since the powerful European monarchs threatened Napoleon's plans to keep France secure with revolutionary ideals, he had limited options but to go to war with them. Myth number 7. Napoleon always had a rivalry with Russia. Although Napoleon famously invaded Russia with about 500,000 men, he and Tsar Alexander were fairly friendly for a while. Their good relationship began when they met at the Treaty of Tilsit, where the Tsar agreed to abide by Napoleon's continental blockade of the British. From then on, they were pretty good friends. In fact, Napoleon described Alexander as especially handsome, like a hero with all the graces of an amiable Parisian. And he even wrote to his wife that, if Alexander were a woman, I would make him my mistress. Eventually, however, their differences would eventually lead to war again. Myth number 8. Napoleon converted to Islam. Napoleon was actually baptized Catholic as a child, but he was not particularly devoted to his faith as he became an adult. During his Egyptian campaign, however, he respected and often partook in many Muslim celebrations, worships, and practices, though he mostly did it in the hopes that he would be seen more favorably as the ruler of a non-French population. Napoleon probably admired some aspects of Islam, but his main purpose in partaking in Muslim activities was to form a better relationship with the people he was ruling. And although he slightly thought about formally converting to Islam, he ultimately did not. Myth number 9. He shot the nose off the Sphinx. While Napoleon spent several years in Egypt, he did not order his troops to use the Sphinx for target practice with cannons. We know this because the Sphinx nose was actually verified to have been gone almost a half a century before Napoleon and his troops even arrived in Egypt. Since Danish naval captain Frederick Norden had made sketches that clearly depicted the Sphinx without a nose in 1737. Myth number 10. Napoleon won all his battles except Waterloo. While Waterloo is his most famous and last defeat, it was far from his only one. Some of his major defeats include the Battle of Aspern-Essling in 1809, when Napoleon attempted to cross the Danube River to engage the Austrian army under Archduke Charles. When his forces split, Austrian troops with their superior position and artillery launched a counterattack that inflicted mass casualties on the French, which destroyed their key pontoon bridges, which trapped many soldiers. Napoleon was forced to retreat, suffering over 20,000 casualties. The Battle of Leipzig is probably his second most famous defeat, taking place in 1813. When Napoleon with 200,000 troops was heavily outnumbered by the massive 350-strong army of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. After multiple days, Napoleon was forced to retreat across the Elster River with 80,000 casualties. The Battle of La Rothiere, fought in 1814, was fought against Russian and Prussian forces under Prince von Blücher, which resulted in Napoleon's retreat as his exhausted troops struggled against the numerically superior and better supplied coalition forces. Myth number 11. Napoleon was exiled once. After his defeat in the War of the Sixth Coalition, Napoleon was forced to abdicate in early 1814. Rather than executing him, the victorious allies allowed Napoleon to keep his title of emperor and exiled him to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. However, this exile was short-lived, as Napoleon escaped less than a year later, returning to France and reclaiming power. The European powers declared war on him personally and mobilized around 100,000 men each to defeat him. Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815 solidified his downfall, and this time the Allied powers were determined to keep him away, so they exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena, located in the South Atlantic Ocean, far from Europe. Unlike Elba, where he had some degree of freedom, Napoleon was kept under strict British supervision, where escape was nearly impossible. He spent the final 6 years of his life there, dying in 1821. Myth number 12. Napoleon was uncaring toward his soldiers. Since Napoleon came from a poor noble family, he understood the hardships the average soldier faced more than most commanders. Napoleon would frequently do difficult and dangerous jobs himself, always working side by side with those he led. He inspected and gave out awards personally, and early on he slept in the same conditions and marched alongside his troops. Though as time went on, health issues and burnout would eventually cause Napoleon to become less and less of the leader he once was. Myth number 13. Napoleon's armies were entirely French. In many earlier battles, Napoleon was in command of mostly or entirely French troops. However, as he became emperor and conquered more and more of Europe, the troops under his command diversified. During his Russian campaign, he commanded a 600,000 strong army. However, less than half of it was French. He used many foreign soldiers from allied nations and nations he had conquered. Men from Italy, Poland, the German state, Spain, the Netherlands, and Switzerland would fight for him. Myth number 14. Napoleon was poisoned. Just after his death on May 5th, 1821, local doctors conducted an autopsy, concluding that he had died due to stomach cancer. However, since he had been suffering from chronic stomach pain, nausea, and hair loss, some believe those symptoms were from arsenic poisoning. This theory gained traction in the 20th century when scientific tests found high levels of arsenic in Napoleon's hair, leading some to suspect that he had been slowly poisoned over time by his British captors or even by someone within his own household. However, since arsenic was commonly found in many household items, including wallpaper, cosmetics, and medicine, exposure to it was far from unusual. Additionally, Napoleon's family had a history of stomach cancer, as his father had also died of the same disease. Myth number 15. Napoleon used a body double to escape from St. Helena. According to this legend, instead of dying in exile in 1821, Napoleon managed to switch places with a loyal follower or body double, allowing him to flee the island undetected and live out the rest of his life under a different name somewhere in Europe or the Americas. The man to allegedly take his place was Francois Eugene Robiaud, a poor Frenchman who is said to have disappeared sometime in 1818 after reportedly being visited by one of Napoleon's generals, Gaspard Gourgaud. However, not only is there no evidence that Francois Eugene ever existed, Napoleon's body was also taken back to Paris and was confirmed to be in fact Napoleon's in 1840. Number 16. Napoleon was anti-religion. Like I said earlier, Napoleon was originally baptized as Catholic, but he became less devoted as he became an adult. And like I said in Myth 8, he did not convert to Islam. He saw religion as a political necessity, often treating religion as a tool for state control and unity. He believed that religion could be useful in maintaining order, strengthening his rule, and ensuring loyalty among his subjects, which is why he restored Catholicism in 1804, though he limited their power by keeping it strictly under state authority. He also granted a major amount of religious freedoms to Protestants and Jews. Myth number 17. Napoleon's last words were Josephine. At the age of 51, Napoleon died on St. Helena on May 5th, 1821. However, the eyewitness accounts of his final hours have many differences regarding his last words. It is likely he said something about the army or head of army, and according to two witnesses, Napoleon also said France and my son. Only one witness, Charles de Montholon, reported that Napoleon said Josephine, but since he wrote his memoirs about 20 years after Napoleon's death while he was imprisoned with Napoleon III, Montholon probably wrote it just to honor his friend and rally the French to Louis Napoleon's cause. So Josephine was most likely not one of Napoleon's last words. The most professional and powerful army of the world marches to Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, ready to crush the rebellion before it starts. But just 24 hours later, they're driven all the way back to Boston. How did a simple American militia manage to defeat the British at the first battles of the American Revolutionary War? Well, after the Boston Tea Party, 4,000 British troops were sent to Boston, and General Thomas Gage was installed as military governor of Massachusetts and commander-in-chief of the British garrison. In April 1775, he had received instructions from Secretary of State William Legge to disarm the rebels and to imprison the rebellion's leaders. So, to try and destroy the rebellion before it started, he sent Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith with about 700 British regulars to seize weapons and powder being stored in Concord, Massachusetts, just 20 miles northwest of Boston, stating, "With utmost expedition and secrecy to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all military stores. But you will take care that the soldiers do not plunder the inhabitants or hurt private property." But since fighting with Native Americans was common, local militias were created to protect towns. And although they did practice, they were not professional soldiers. They were made up of farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, and ordinary men who trained only part-time. Although they were not professional, they were prepared for a fight. On April 18th, 1775, physician and Sons of Liberty member Joseph Warren had learned some secret information. The British were marching toward Concord that night. Immediately, Warren dispatched 2 men to warn the Minutemen, silversmith Paul Revere and tanner William Dawes. These men were crucial to the soon-be victory of the Americans. Without this secret intelligence, the militia might not have been ready in time to arm themselves, but almost more importantly, they would not have time to hide their secret stash of military supplies. As hundreds of British regulars under Major John Pickard entered Lexington around 5 a.m. on April 19, 1775, they found 77 Lexington militiamen led by Captain John Parker, who stated, "I ordered our militia to meet on the common in said Lexington to consult what to do," and concluded not to be discovered, nor meddle or make with said regular troops, unless they should insult or molest us. And upon their sudden approach, I immediately ordered our militia to disperse and not to fire. Immediately, said troops made their appearance and rushed furiously, fired upon and killed 8 of our party, without receiving any provocation, therefore, from us. Captain Parker knew he was outmatched and was not trying to fight the army in front of him that vastly outnumbered him. He was simply putting on a show of political strength rather than placing his men in an actual fighting position. So, when a British officer shouted, "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels," Captain Parker actually did order his men to disperse and go home. But that is when it happened. No one knows who did it, but a shot rang out across the field. Chaos rapidly engulfed every soldier, who aimed their weapon and fired. Several British volleys were unleashed before order could be restored, so when the smoke cleared, 8 militiamen lay dead and 9 were wounded, while only 1 British soldier was injured. Soon after, the British continued on their journey to Concord. However, due to Revere's ride through the towns of Somerville, Medford, and Arlington, other riders were sent out, and all of the militias in the Massachusetts countryside knew of the coming threat. Minutemen from nearby towns rapidly began to flood into the Concord area. The Americans may have been defeated at Lexington, but the British were in for a rude awakening. When the British regulars entered Concord at 8 a.m., they searched the town and houses for arms, but they found little. Meanwhile, the militias who retreated from the town center began regrouping at North Bridge, a strategic crossing outside the town. Here, the colonial forces, now numbering around 400, outnumbered the smaller detachment of 100 British soldiers guarding the North Bridge. Seeing the smoke from the burning of supplies, the colonial Minutemen under Major John Buttrick and Captain Isaac Davis advanced toward the bridge. The frightened British fired a small volley, leaving Major Buttrick no choice but to order a return volley, shouting, "For God's sake, fire," marking the first time colonial militia were officially ordered to fire on British soldiers, making this the shot heard round the world. Multiple British soldiers were hit, forcing them to retreat. Colonel Smith, around noon, recognizing how exposed he was, orders a full-on retreat back to Boston. But this is where things fell completely apart for them. By this time, thousands of militia have surrounded the road back. As the British retreated, they were hit with massive guerrilla-style counterattacks all along the entire 18-mile-long route, using their knowledge of the terrain to a devastating effect. They hid behind stone walls, trees, and fences, ambushing the redcoats from all sides before they could even return fire. Although unconventional, it was highly effective. The British, who were trained for open-field European warfare in their tight formations and bright red uniforms, made them easy targets. Marching in columns through narrow country roads turned into a nightmare as shots rained down from hidden positions. The speed and stealth of the Americans had won them the day, inflicting 300 casualties, including 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 53 missing and captured, while the Americans only suffered 93 casualties, 49 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing and captured. Only 3 men in US history have ever held a rank higher than a 5-star general, but why and how was the 6-star rank created? Well, in 1799, Congress attempted to elevate George Washington above all other generals. So on March 3rd, 1799, they stated that a commander of the Army of the United States shall be appointed and commissioned by the style of General of the Armies of the United States, and the present office and title of Lieutenant General shall therefore be abolished. However, President John Adams never officially promoted Washington to this rank, so since Washington died on December 14th, 1799, and the law expired just a few years later on March 16th, 1802, nothing really came of the rank. Washington officially died with the 3-star rank of Lieutenant General. So, the origin of the rank General of the Armies really began in 1919, with American General John J. Pershing. notably the only person to officially hold the rank during his lifetime. But why was it created? Well, during World War I, Pershing led the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe, being in command of over 2 million American troops. His exceptional leadership, organization, and command convinced many that he deserved a higher rank in order to honor his achievements. So Congress and the War Department elevated Pershing above the standard general officer ranks with Public Law 6645, stating that the office of General of the Armies of the United States is hereby revived. Rank and precedence over said officer is hereby repealed, provided that no more than one appointment to office shall be made under the terms of this act. Pershing had seniority over all other officers, even the 5-star generals during World War II, as Public Law 78482 stated. Nothing in this act shall affect the provisions of the Act of September 3, 1919. Or any other law relating to the office of General of the Armies of the United States. However, Pershing oddly wore 4 gold stars as his insignia instead of the standard silver stars. Though since his rank is above a 5-star general, it is only logical to conclude it is, in fact, a 6-star rank, though of course it is not official insignia. The next person to be promoted to the rank was George Washington in 1976 for the bicentennial anniversary of the creation of the United States. This promotion was of course made posthumously, since many felt that no one should ever outrank the father of the country. And in fact, Washington outranks the other 2 men on the list, even though they're technically the same rank. Washington has rank and precedence over all other grades of the Army, past or present. So Washington will always be the most senior general of the United States for all time. Lastly, there is Ulysses S. Grant, who has the most confusing series of ranks. You see, due to Grant's exceptional leadership during the Civil War, he was promoted to the rank General of the Army in 1866, the highest rank at the time, which was 4 stars. However, this is also the name of the 5-star rank used during World War II, given to people such as Eisenhower and MacArthur. But that is not even the end of the complications, since in 1924, the Comptroller General of the United States ruled that Grant's rank, titled General of the Army, was actually the same as Washington's intended rank in 1799. They stated, it thus appears that the office of General was first created in 1799 by the title of General of the Armies of the United States, and that it was again revived in 1919 by the title of General of the Armies of the United States. That it is one and the same office, that of General, is unquestioned, meaning Pershing's rank, General of the Armies, that was derived from 1799, was one of the same as Grant's rank, General of the Army. So even though the 5-star generals in World War II held the title rank General of the Army, it is different from Grant's. It is still unclear why exactly the names are different. And, to make this even more confusing, 2 other men were promoted to the same rank Grant held in the 1800s, William T. Sherman and Philip Sheridan. So the obvious question is whether those 2 men are also on the same level as Washington, Grant, and Pershing. But either way, in 2024, General Ulysses S. Grant was officially given the 6-star rank General of the Armies, placing him in the same rank as George Washington and John J. Pershing. Though, as I explained before, Pershing and Grant are technically outranked by Washington. Only one man in US history has ever held the rank Admiral of the Navy. But why do some consider it a 6-star rank? Well, in 1898, the United States was at war with Spain, and sent Commodore George Dewey on a mission to obliterate the Spanish Navy at Manila Bay. The battle was as one-sided as it gets, with the Americans only suffering 1 dead, 9 injured, and no ship sunk, while the Spanish suffered 77 dead, 271 wounded, and 9 ships sunk. This massive victory made George Dewey a naval legend and an American hero. So, to honor Dewey's decisive victory, Congress in 1899 decided to promote Dewey to the rank Admiral of the Navy. But there was one problem: a paperwork mistake. So, George Dewey wasn't made Admiral of the Navy, he was accidentally made Admiral in the Navy, a rank that he already had. Though President Theodore Roosevelt in 1903 did eventually fix this mistake, making George Dewey Admiral of the Navy. Dewey, however, only wore 4 stars. So, many consider Dewey's rank as just another 4-star rank with a fancy honorary title. But if Dewey only wore 4 stars, why do some say it is a 6-star rank? Well, during World War II, the US needed their admirals to be equal to the highest naval officers from other nations. So, Congress established the new 5-star rank Fleet Admiral. The Department of the Navy specified that The rank of Fleet Admiral of the United States Navy shall be considered the senior-most rank of the United States Navy. Dewey had been dead for nearly 30 years at that point, and so was his rank. As no one else had been promoted to his rank, the rank had basically died with him. The Admiral of the Navy rank had been tied to him and him only, so it wasn't really seen as a permanent new rank in the ranking system, more as a symbolic title. However, as the US was planning a full-scale invasion of Japan, plans began to promote Douglas MacArthur to a higher rank, General of the Armies, a rank that many believed to be a 6-star rank. If you want to learn more, check out my video where I break down this 6-star general. So, if the Army actually did go through with this, it is likely an Admiral would have needed to be promoted as well, and that new naval rank likely would have been called Admiral of the Navy. Some in Congress attempted to revive Dewey's rank, Admiral of the Navy, and put it on par with the Army rank, General of the Armies. Congress even had the Navy's Chief of Naval Personnel, Vice Admiral Randall Jacobs, testify before the Committee on Naval Affairs of the House of Representatives, recommending that the rank of Admiral of the Navy should be equivalent to General of the Armies. Ultimately, if Dewey's rank, Admiral of the Navy, was put on par with General of the Armies, Dewey's rank would likely be considered a 6-star rank. Eventually, the attempts to put Dewey's Admiral of the Navy rank on par as the Army, General of the Armies, failed. However, there's actually one more twist. Naval regulations actually gave Dewey's rank of Admiral of the Navy a 19-gun salute, equivalent to the 5-star rank Fleet Admiral, which was also given a 19-gun salute. So, some argue that even though Dewey only wore 4 stars, the naval regulations and the gun salutes clearly show how Dewey's rank would be on par with Fleet Admiral today. Still, the Navy never revived the rank, and George Dewey, the only person to hold the rank, only wore 4 stars. But, depending on how you look at it, Dewey is either a lower rank, the same rank, or a higher rank than Fleet Admiral. December 16th, 1944. American troops in the freezing cold await a jolly Christmas season. But suddenly, the Ardennes forest is flooded with German tanks, artillery, and infantry. The Germans have just launched their last major offensive on the Western Front. But why did the Germans think launching an offensive was a good idea, and why did it ultimately break them? Although the Allies had landed on the European continent and were pushing the Germans out of France, Hitler believed that if Germany could just win one final offensive, the tide could change and force negotiations for a separate peace deal with just the Americans and British. And with the Western Front at peace, the Germans could focus their resources on their biggest enemy, the Soviet Union. Since Germany was in a weak defensive position, negotiations were unlikely to happen. So, the German High Command came up with a plan. Well, not really a new plan, they basically just copied what worked for them during the fall of France in 1940. Similar to their plan in 1940, they intended to launch a massive offensive through the Ardennes, encircling the British at the coast and splitting the Allied forces in 2. Additionally, they planned to capture the valuable supply port city of Antwerp. Although a decent plan on paper, Hitler completely misread the situation. The German military was simply in no shape for an offensive this late into the war. In 1940, the Germans had air superiority, fuel, and momentum. In 1944, the Red Army in the east had advanced hundreds of miles, destroying hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of tanks and aircraft, while the Americans and British had unleashed a massive strategic bombing campaign on German soil, crippling their oil production, railways, and aircraft and tank output. German manpower was extremely weak as well, with the age of conscription being lowered and raised. So if the German generals and marshals knew this, why did they go ahead with it anyway? Well, a few factors are involved. For one, the Allies actually weren't in the best of shape either. Despite liberating France extremely quickly, their gains had heavily fatigued their army, and made their supply lines pretty stretched out. Additionally, the Allied generals generally did not think a German offensive would happen, giving the Germans the element of surprise. But the biggest reason no one spoke out was because High Command at the time either followed Hitler's word to a T, or simply too afraid to speak out. In fact, many in High Command did not have any faith in the operation. This plan hasn't got a damned leg to stand on. The whole operation has less than a 10% chance of success. The forces available for Watch on the Rhine are extremely weak in comparison to the enemy. I have grave doubts whether it would be possible to hold the ground won, unless the enemy is completely destroyed. Ultimately, Operation Watch on the Rhine went ahead on December 16, 1944. The Allies, not prepared for a German assault, got a harsh reality check with over 200,000 soldiers and over 1,000 tanks and assault vehicles pounding their lines. Despite the German shortcomings, the initial German offensive actually did not go too bad for them. The American troops in the Ardennes region were either new and inexperienced, or were resting from 6 months of battle in France. So the Germans actually were able to push back the Allied forces, creating a bulge in their lines, which is how the battle got the name. Many Allied troops were encircled by the Germans, and at this point, many Germans actually believed that they had turned the tide around, with one soldier writing, "I think the war in the West is again turning." However, their successes would not last long. The poor weather early on had concealed German troop movements, and prevented the Allies from using their superior aircraft to send in paratroopers, unleash bombing raids, and scout positions. So, when the weather eventually cleared, the Allied Air Force was able to once again completely overwhelm the German forces. Since Germany designed the entire offensive around stealing Allied fuel, when small, mostly American units were able to halt or slow the German advances, they could not keep up with their strict schedule. After just a few days, the 80,000 Americans in the Ardennes had been backed up by almost 500,000 Allied troops. Since the Germans did not gain enough territory fast enough, they couldn't take Allied fuel, so they were not able to continue their offensive. Eventually, the Allies began a counterattack. Famously, General George S. Patton was able to relieve the Americans at Bastogne. With the bulge turning into a battle of attrition, there was ever only going to be one clear winner: the logistical juggernaut of the Allied forces. By the end of January, the bulge had closed up. Germany's gamble had faltered, and hopes of a separate peace were gone. Although the Germans did inflict heavy losses on the Allies, the casualties the Germans received were much more devastating to their cause. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945, Germany had lost between 80,000 and 100,000 men, including around 15,000 killed, many of whom were their most experienced veteran troops. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned, over 2,000 vehicles were lost, and the Luftwaffe lost a few hundred aircraft. Even worse, Germany had burned through their final fuel reserves. The elite panzer formations destroyed in the Ardennes would never be rebuilt, and the divisions pulled from other fronts made it easier for the Red Army's final surge towards Berlin. After the Battle of the Bulge, Germany never again launched a major offensive on the Western Front, and just 4 months later, Germany unconditionally surrendered. Today, we have many treaties that limit certain tactics or weapons in warfare. But what if we go further back? Why and how did bans on certain weapons work in medieval times? And why specifically did the Catholic Church ban crossbows? The first argument you might think of is that the crossbow was simply such a powerful weapon that it had to be banned. But that is not really the case. As I outlined in my longbow versus crossbow video, longbows, not just crossbows, could pierce and kill knights in armor. Maybe not as well, but it was known to happen. So the next argument would be the lack of training requirements. Unlike traditional weapons, such as the longbow, which needed years and often decades to become effective at the weapon, the crossbow could be learned and shot within hours and perfected within weeks and months, allowing mere peasant soldiers to kill heavily armored knights from a distance with relatively little training. This would undermine the feudal hierarchy, where noble knights represented a privileged warrior class that relied on their superior equipment and combat skills to dominate battles. The church feared that this shift in power dynamics could destabilize society by eroding the traditional social order and diminish the perceived divine authority of the noble class. While the argument isn't exactly false, it wasn't really the main concern of Pope Innocent II. The real main concern of the Pope was the mass killing of Christians in Europe. Although you might think of the Crusades, the banding together of Christian Europe to push back the Muslims from their territory, that was a major exception, as Christians in Europe at the time battled and killed each other constantly. So, to try and limit the number of Christian deaths, Pope Innocent II at the Second Lateran Council in 1139 stated, "We prohibit under anathema that murderous art of crossbowmen and archers, which is hateful to God, to be employed against Christians and Catholics from now on." Wait, hold on, it says "and archers." Yep, that is right, crossbowmen and archers were banned. Not just crossbowmen. So, since the crossbow and longbow were both banned, the argument that the crossbow was some uniquely powerful weapon is not true. And even the argument that the lack of training required for it scared the Catholic Church isn't exactly true either, since it is pretty clear the main concern was simply that it was a ranged weapon. Pope Innocent II clearly saw any ranged weapon as too dangerous to be used against Christians. And as you can see, the ban only applied to Christians, so any deployment of ranged weapons against Muslims, Jews, heathens, or anybody else was fair game according to the council. Anyone who violated the law would have been excommunicated from the church. However, if a law is never really enforced, it isn't even really a law. We can see this in another decree during the Second Lateran Council, which stated, "We entirely forbid, moreover, those abominable jousts and tournaments in which knights come together by agreement and rashly engage in showing off their physical prowess and daring, and which often result in human deaths and danger to souls. If any of them dies on these occasions, although penance and viaticum are not to be denied when he requests them, he is to be deprived of a church burial." So although the Catholic Church tried to assert moral authority over military practices between Christian kingdoms, the decree basically did nothing. Most Christians ignored the ban and carried on killing each other with their crossbows and longbows. Not to mention the spears, swords, axes, and hammers, which apparently did not bother the Catholic Church. The longbow versus the crossbow. Which weapon truly ruled medieval warfare? Although bows and crossbows were used for hundreds and thousands of years, I'm going to be specifically talking about longbows versus crossbows during medieval European warfare. To compare them, I will be using multiple metrics, including range, rate of fire, penetrating power, training requirements, and expensiveness. And finally, to reveal the winner, I'm going to add them all up and explain their battle application. First off, let's look at range. Medieval longbows, particularly the English longbow, were renowned for their impressive range. Historical evidence and modern reproductions suggest that skilled archers could achieve distances of 250 to 350 yards. However, the effective killing range of longbows was generally considered to be around 200 yards, although this could vary depending on factors such as weather, conditions, and the archer's skill. Crossbows, on the other hand, have a more complex answer in terms of range. Early medieval crossbows were almost always outranged by longbows. However, as the medieval period progressed, crossbow technology improved significantly, leading to increased power and range. 15th century crossbows were known to be able to launch bolts up to 400 yards, and potentially more, which would likely outperform most longbows in terms of maximum distance. However, it's crucial to know that maximum range and effective combat range are not the same. While a crossbow might be able to shoot a bolt over a great distance, its effective range, the distance at which it could not only accurately hit a target, but also actually puncture whatever armor and kill the target, was typically much shorter, around 180 to 200 yards, while a longbow was usually a bit further, around 220 to 250 yards. So overall, I'm giving the longbow an 8 out of 10 for range, and the crossbow a 5 out of 10. Next, rate of fire. It is generally believed that skilled longbowmen could outshoot a crossbowman around 10 times in a minute. So for every minute, a longbowman could shoot around 10 to 12 arrows, while a crossbowman could only shoot 1 to 2 bolts. However, that is only at the extreme, where the firing rate is being tested at its max. In reality, the rate of fire would be much closer. You see, since it takes no strength to hold back the crossbow, you would get way less tired shooting it for hours compared to the longbow, where even shooting it at half your max fire rate, around 6 arrows per minute, could gas you out in mere minutes. So in practice, nearly at all times, longbowmen would not shoot at their max fire rate. In fact, their fire rate could even be less than the crossbow. If multiple crossbowmen stand in a line, one can shoot while the others reload their weapon. Or if a person has 2 crossbows, he can shoot while another person helps reload his second weapon. In these scenarios, crossbowmen could keep up a sustained rate of fire without any of them actually exerting their strength to fire the weapon. Now, archers with bows could do this too, but that is one example of a way a squad of men with crossbows could keep up a good fire rate. Additionally, the amount of arrows at one's disposal will also determine your fire rate. At the beginning of the battle, you don't want to unleash all of your arrows at once. you generally want to allow a sustained rate of fire throughout the battle. So although a max speed of the longbow would absolutely destroy the crossbow in rate of fire, in practice the difference was much less. So I am giving the longbow a 6 out of 10 and a crossbow a 3 out of 10 in rate of fire. Next up, penetrating power. The draw weight between crossbows and longbows was massive, especially during the later medieval times, around the 14th and 15th centuries, when some crossbows had a draw weight of up to 1,400 pounds. Though for the most part, crossbows would generally have a draw weight of 700 to 1,000, while most longbows were typically around 80 to 180 pounds. However, a crossbow's draw weight was mostly to compensate for it being a way shorter string than a traditional bow, so the actual penetrating power is not as big as you might think. Additional factors such as arrow type of armor, and range you were at can affect the outcome. Due to limited supply and the logistics of arming a lot of troops, many soldiers wore weakened armor. Additionally, other soldiers wouldn't be wearing any plate armor or chainmail armor, just leather and padding, so longbows, especially equipped with bodkin point arrows, could potentially pierce multiple types of armor. However, overall, it seems that the crossbow does penetrate armor better, so I'm giving it a 7 out of 10 and the longbow a 5 out of 10. Next, training requirements. Despite its advantages, the longbow was limited by the need for extensive training. Some nations with a culture around longbows, like England and Wales, maintain a strict policy of archery practice. In fact, English King Edward III's archery law of 1363 declared, "Whereas the people of our realm, rich and poor alike, were accustomed formerly in their games to practice archery, whence by God's help, it is well known that high honor and profit came to our realm, and no small advantage to ourselves in our warlike enterprises. That every man in the same country, if he able-bodied, shall upon holidays make use in his games of bows and arrows, and so learn and practice archery." These laws requiring men to train regularly from a young age, usually around 7, ensured a steady supply of skilled archers. But if they were wiped out, they were very difficult to replace. Not only was learning the actual skill of the longbow difficult, but it also required immense strength. Longbowmen weren't just trained, they were built for war. The physical demands of using a longbow were substantial, with draw weights ranging from 80 to 180 pounds. This high draw weight meant that years of practice were needed to develop the necessary muscle mass and skill to effectively shoot. In fact, the longbow often deformed people. Today, we can see the physical toll of the longbow in the skeletal remains of archers, which often showed thick left arms, wrists, and shoulders with a disordered spine. The crossbow, by contrast, could be used effectively with only a few weeks or months of training, making it a much more accessible weapon for the average person. Unlike the longbow, which requires muscle mass and strength along with accuracy, the crossbow only requires accuracy. If you give a crossbow to a person, within the first day they could actually shoot it. Probably not accurately, but they could at least launch a bolt. Compare that to a person who was new to the longbow. They would struggle to even draw their bowstring back, let alone hit anything accurately. This is ultimately why crossbows became very popular across many European nations. Crossbowmen, however, were still expected to be competent soldiers, capable of operating effectively on the battlefield. So many of them were still training hard, learning about their weapon and all the mechanical aids needed for drawing it. Overall, I am giving the longbow a 1 out of 10 for training requirements and the crossbow a 9 out of 10. Lastly, expensiveness. As you can imagine, the longbows made simply of wood were much cheaper than crossbows. Although many longbows were actually made of hardened and cured wood that would take around 4 years to create. But ultimately, devices used to draw the crossbow string, like the stirrup and windlass, were not only expensive, being made of iron or steel, but they were also very complicated to make. In fact, the entire crossbow was simply more complex and more expensive to make than the longbow. So it most likely broke down a decent amount in the field, and if you didn't know how to fix it, or have the right tools to fix it, you simply couldn't shoot. While this could happen to the longbow, the string or wood being broken, the crossbow's mechanics, in my opinion, were much more open to failure. Another point in terms of expensiveness is reusability. If 100 longbowmen die, their bows pretty much become useless unless you can find well-trained men very soon after. But if 100 crossbowmen die, you can easily reuse the weapons by arming inexperienced experienced men very soon after. Overall, I am giving the longbow an 8 out of 10 and the crossbow a 3 out of 10 in expensiveness. So which one is better? Well, it depends on the terrain, the nation's resources, and the enemy's troops. But that is boring, so after adding up all the scores, out of a score of 50, the longbow got a 28 and the crossbow got a 27. So I personally would have to say overall, the longbow is more applicable in more battle situations. The main drawbacks of the longbow are the training requirements and penetrating power, but it beats the crossbow in terms of range, rate of fire, and expensiveness. And the only one where the crossbow dominates is at training requirements, since I explained the longbow could generally penetrate the same armor as the crossbow could. In medieval battles, we can literally look at how the